It was a warm and calm afternoon, the kind that makes people slow down and enjoy simple things. The sun reflected gently on the surface of the pool in the backyard, making the whole place look peaceful and private. The homeowner, Daniel, had planned to spend the day doing nothing more than sitting by the water, stretching his legs out and letting the quiet settle around him. He had worked long hours the week before, and this weekend felt like a small reward. Daniel had lived in the house for only a few months, and even though he had already grown attached to it, he still felt like he was settling into a new chapter of his life. The renovations he completed recently had transformed the backyard into his favorite place. New tiles around the pool, clean stone paths, fresh plants along the fence, everything made him feel proud. He loved knowing he had created a space that felt peaceful and comfortable. But while Daniel enjoyed the afternoon, he had no idea that his quiet moment was being watched from the house next door. His neighbor, Mrs. Alden, had moved into her home only a short while before he arrived. She was older, very strict, and seemed to pay attention to every detail around her. Anyone walking by, any motion in the street or backyard, her eyes were usually there first. She had seen Daniel before, but never long enough to really register who he was. The few times they crossed paths, it was either early in the morning or late in the evening when Daniel was coming home from work. Because of this, she had formed her own assumption that he was not the actual homeowner. She believed the house belonged to someone older, someone she thought she had seen moving boxes on the day Daniel first arrived. She didn't know that person was only a friend helping Daniel move in. So when Mrs. Alden glanced out her window and saw Daniel sitting by the pool, she didn't think, "Oh, the neighbor is relaxing." Instead, she frowned, leaned closer to the window, and stared longer than necessary. Her suspicion grew quickly. She convinced herself that someone who looked as relaxed and casual as Daniel could not possibly be the owner. Her imagination filled in the rest. Maybe he had jumped the fence. Maybe he was using the house while the real owner was away. Maybe he was trying to break in and pretend he belonged there. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that something was wrong. She watched him for several minutes, expecting him to do something that would prove her theory right. But Daniel simply sat by the water, occasionally dipping his hand into the pool or adjusting his chair. He wasn't acting suspiciously at all. But her mind was already firmly set. Instead of walking outside and asking a simple question that could have solved everything in seconds, she reached for her phone. She told herself she was being responsible, even protective of the neighborhood. She wanted to believe she was preventing a possible crime. So, with steady determination, she dialed the local police and reported what she believed to be a trespasser. Meanwhile, Daniel remained completely unaware of the drama building next door. He was enjoying the warmth of the sun on his face, the sound of water lightly moving against the edges of the pool, and the feeling of finally having a place that belonged to him. After years of renting apartments and dealing with noisy neighbors, he loved the privacy his new home provided. He stretched his arms, closed his eyes, and let the peacefulness sink in. But oddly enough, he did sense something, a strange feeling that someone was staring at him. He opened his eyes and glanced toward the fence, seeing only a closed window and the shadows inside the neighbor's house. He didn't think much of it. People sometimes look around their yard or check their windows. Nothing unusual about that. So he went back to relaxing. A few minutes later, he heard the faint sound of something moving on the street. It wasn't loud, but it stood out in the quiet afternoon. Daniel raised his head slightly, listening. He heard the sound again, a rolling vibration, like tires on gravel. Then, suddenly he heard another sound, the clicking of a car door closing. He didn't know it yet. But two police officers were approaching his house with cautious steps. Their car was parked near the curb, outside the gate. They had responded quickly because the report made it sound urgent. As far as they knew, someone might be trespassing, possibly attempting to break into a property. Daniel stood up and walked slowly toward the patio when he heard a firm knock at the front gate. A voice called out, steady and official, "Sir. Police department. Could you come to the gate, please?" Daniel froze for a moment, caught completely off guard. Police here? For what? He felt a rush of confusion, wondering if they were looking for someone else or if something happened nearby. He wiped his hands on a towel and made his way toward the gate. When he opened it, he saw two uniformed officers standing there. They looked calm but serious. One of them gave a small nod and said, "Afternoon, sir. We received a call about someone possibly trespassing on this property." Daniel blinked, unsure he had heard correctly. Trespassing? On his own home? Before he could respond, he noticed movement from the neighbor's side. Mrs. Alden had stepped outside. Watching with an expression that suggested she believed she was doing something heroic, he didn't say anything yet. He was too surprised to form a complete sentence. He looked at the officers, then back at his neighbor, trying to understand how relaxing by his own pool had turned into this unexpected situation. The officers continued speaking politely, explaining that they needed to check who he was and what he was doing on the property. Daniel took a slow breath, still confused, still trying to understand how the whole situation had unfolded without him knowing, as he stood there at the gate. The peaceful afternoon was gone. In its place was a strange and uncomfortable tension. Without realizing it, Daniel was about to face a series of awkward questions, skeptical looks, and the weight of a misunderstanding that had grown out of nothing more than a neighbor's imagination. The moment he never expected was only beginning, and he could already sense that this calm day was turning into something he would remember for a long time. Daniel stood at the gate, still confused as the officers waited patiently for him to respond. The peaceful afternoon he had enjoyed moments ago felt like a distant memory now. He rubbed the back of his neck, trying to make sense of everything. This was his house, his pool, his backyard. How could anyone think he was trespassing? And why would the police be here for something so unusual? Before he could speak, the shorter officer gently repeated, "Sir, we just need to confirm you're allowed to be here. We got a call from a concerned neighbor." Daniel looked over at Mrs. Alden, who stood on her porch with her arms crossed. She didn't look angry, but she looked firmly convinced of something very wrong. He had seen her a few times, but had never spoken more than a polite wave or a short greeting. She didn't return smiles, and she rarely said hello. Now he understood why. She had never taken a moment to know him at all. Trying to stay calm, Daniel let out a small breath and said, "I live here. This is my home." The taller officer nodded kindly. "I understand, sir, but we still have to verify. Do you have some form of identification we can check?" "Sure," Daniel said, forcing a steady tone. "Let me grab my wallet." He opened the gate slightly and stepped back into the house, leaving the officers waiting outside. As he walked inside, he felt a mix of frustration and disbelief. He never expected something like this to happen, especially not when he was simply relaxing in his own backyard. But what bothered him most was the idea that someone had seen him and immediately assumed he didn't belong. He grabbed his wallet from the table near the living room and returned to the gate. The officers remained calm, which eased some of his nerves. He handed them his ID, explaining, "I moved in a few months ago. I've been doing renovations, so maybe she didn't realize I live here." The shorter officer examined the ID and nodded. "This does match the address, but we'll need just a bit more to confirm fully. Nothing personal, just procedure." "I understand," Daniel said, even though inside he felt a bit embarrassed. He knew the officers were only doing their job, but it was strange to be treated like someone who might not belong in his own home. Then, from behind the officers, Mrs. Alden cleared her throat loudly. "Officers," she said, as if addressing a meeting, "I told you he didn't live there. The real owner is older. I saw him months ago." Daniel stared at her, wanting to correct her right away. But the officer holding his ID gently raised a hand, signaling for everyone to remain calm. "Ma'am," the taller officer said in a respectful but firm voice, "we're verifying the situation. Please allow us to finish." Mrs. Alden pursed her lips but stayed silent. The taller officer turned back to Daniel. "Sir, would it be possible for us to step inside and just confirm a few details?" "It won't take long." "Of course," Daniel replied. He stepped aside and opened the gate fully. The officers entered carefully, glancing around but without suspicion in their eyes. They were simply checking, following the report they had received. He led them toward the back door. Passing the patio area where he had been relaxing, the table still held his glass of iced tea, his towel, and his book. The officers noticed the items and exchanged a quick look, but not one of doubt. It was the kind of glance that suggested everything they saw so far aligned with Daniel's explanation. As they entered the house, Daniel pointed toward a small drawer near the hallway. "I can show you documents if needed. The deed, utility bills? Anything you need, I would be helpful," the shorter officer said kindly. Daniel reached into the drawer and pulled out a small folder where he kept important papers. He handed them several documents: the house purchase records, his utility bills with his name on the address, some renovation permits he had recently filed. Everything was clear and easy to understand. The officers took a moment to read through them. Their serious expressions softened as the truth became obvious. The taller officer let out a quiet breath and nodded slowly. "All right, everything checks out. Thank you for cooperating," of course, Daniel said. Though he still felt uncomfortable knowing that this entire situation could have been avoided with a simple conversation from his neighbor. The officers stepped back outside, with Daniel. Returning to the front yard, Mrs. Alden was still on her porch, standing exactly where she had been. He wondered how long she had been watching him before making the call. The taller officer walked a few steps toward her. "Ma'am," he said, "we've confirmed that he is the owner of the property." The look on her face changed immediately. At first she frowned as if she couldn't believe it. Then she blinked several times, trying to process the information. Her mouth opened slightly, and she took a small step back. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice softer now. "I thought it's his home," the officer repeated gently. "Everything matches." Mrs. Alden glanced at Daniel, and for the first time since this strange situation began, she seemed unsure of herself. Her posture shifted. Her shoulders dropped slightly, and she lowered her eyes, clearly realizing she had made a mistake. Not only a mistake, but one that brought police, officers into her neighbor's day for no real reason. Daniel didn't know what to say. He wasn't angry, but he felt awkward. Part of him wanted her to understand the trouble she had caused, but another part of him knew that people sometimes act out of fear or assumptions without thinking. The officers gave Daniel back his ID. "Sorry for the inconvenience," the shorter one said. "Sometimes calls like these come from misunderstandings. You handled it well." "Thanks," Daniel said quietly. "I appreciate that." The officers turned toward their car, ready to leave. As they walked down the path, the taller officer paused, then looked back at Daniel. "If anything like this happens again, don't hesitate to call us if you feel uncomfortable. But hopefully, this clears things up." Daniel nodded. "I hope so too." When the police car finally pulled away, the street became quiet again. The tension slowly melted into the stillness of the afternoon. But even though the officers were gone, the weight of the situation still lingered. Mrs. Alden stayed on her porch for a long moment, staring at the ground. Daniel waited, wondering if she would say something, an apology, maybe, or an explanation. She looked like she wanted to, but she wasn't quite ready. Without saying a word, she walked back inside her house. Closing the door behind her, Daniel stood by the gate for a while after she left. His backyard, which had felt so peaceful earlier, now felt different. Not unsafe, just unsettled, as if the air still held the echo of everything that had happened. He walked back to the patio and sat down in the same chair he had been relaxing in earlier. The sun was still warm, and the sound of the pool water was still soft and calming. But his mind was too active to relax again. He thought about how easily people could misunderstand situations, how quickly assumptions could turn into problems, and how strange it felt to be questioned in his own home because someone didn't recognize him still. He tried to settle back into the moment. He took a sip of his now slightly warm iced tea, closed his eyes for a few seconds, and let out a long breath. The day wasn't ruined, but it had certainly taken a surprising turn. Daniel knew there were still things left unresolved. Mrs. Alden had made a mistake. In one way or another, they would have to talk eventually. Whether she would apologize or simply pretend nothing happened, he didn't know. But he sensed that this was only the start of a bigger story, a story that would eventually lead to an important moment, one that neither of them expected. For now, though, he sat quietly, listening to the soft ripples of the water, letting the afternoon settle again As he waited for whatever would come next, Daniel sat quietly in his backyard. Long after the police car had disappeared down the street, the calm afternoon sunlight still warmed the tiles around the pool, but it didn't feel the same as it had earlier. His thoughts kept circling back to what had just happened. How quickly a peaceful day had turned into something stressful and strange. How easily someone could mistake a harmless moment for something suspicious. And how surprising it felt to be questioned on his own property because of a misunderstanding he never saw coming. After a while, Daniel stood up and walked slowly toward the house. He glanced once more toward the neighbor's yard. The curtains were closed now and the porch was empty. It seemed like Mrs. Alden had retreated inside, probably embarrassed, maybe confused, maybe replaying the scene in her mind just as Daniel was. He stepped inside and placed his documents back in the drawer. He set his wallet on the table and took a deep breath. He knew he needed a moment to clear his head. Even though the police had left, the weight of the situation lingered. It wasn't anger he felt, just a mix of discomfort, surprise, and a little sadness that something so simple had turned into something so complicated. He poured himself a fresh glass of iced tea and sat on the couch. The cold drink helped settle him a bit. As he sat there, his mind wandered to the first day he moved in. He remembered feeling excited about a fresh start, a new home, a new neighborhood. He remembered telling himself that this place would be peaceful, that it would be a step forward in his life. He never imagined that sitting by his own pool would result in police officers knocking at his gate. Daniel leaned back, trying to let it go. People make mistakes. Neighbors misunderstand things sometimes. Maybe she had her own worries, her own fears. Maybe she acted without thinking. He tried to see the situation through her eyes, even though her judgment had been far from fair. As he sat there lost in thought, he heard something light footsteps outside his door, soft enough to be hesitant, but steady enough to be purposeful. Someone was there. Someone who wasn't quite sure if they should knock. A moment later, gentle tapping broke the silence. Daniel stood up slowly. He already had a feeling who it might be. He walked to the door and opened it carefully. There she was, Mrs. Alden. Her posture was stiff, her hands clasped together tightly, and for the first time since she moved in, her expression wasn't stern or distant. She looked unsure, maybe even nervous. "Hello," she said in a small voice. It was the first time he had heard her speak more than a single word. "Hi," Daniel replied, keeping his tone calm. She took a long breath, her eyes drifting down toward the ground. I think I owe you an apology." Daniel didn't say anything yet. He simply waited, giving her space to speak. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought someone was. Well, using your property without permission. I didn't recognize you, and I should have. I should have asked. I should have talked to you first." Her gaze lifted for a moment but quickly dropped again. "I'm embarrassed about what happened. I truly am." Daniel saw the sincerity in her face. She wasn't making excuses. She wasn't trying to hide her mistake. She was genuinely trying to fix it. And that softened something inside him. "It's all right," he said gently. "I understand you were trying to help in your own way. It just caught me by surprise," she nodded, swallowing hard. "I imagine it did. I would have been shocked too." There was a long pause between them, the kind that usually feels awkward, but here it felt needed. She was gathering herself, and he was deciding how to move forward. "I'm still getting used to this neighborhood," she said quietly. "I haven't met many people yet. I guess I've been too cautious, maybe too quick to think the worst." Daniel gave a small, understanding smile. Moving to a new place can be strange at first. "I know the feeling." Another pause. Then, surprisingly, she smiled just a little. "Thank you for being so calm about everything. You could have reacted differently." Daniel shrugged gently. "Well, stress doesn't really help anyone, right?" She nodded again, appreciating the kindness. "If you ever need anything, or if something like this ever happens again, though I hope it doesn't, you can always knock on my door." He nodded. "And if you ever have questions about something you see, Feel free to ask me. Communication might avoid trouble next time. Her cheeks turned pink at the reminder, but she accepted it with a nod. Yes, you're right about that. After a small moment of silence, she turned to leave. But before she stepped away from the door, she paused and said softly, I really am sorry. No, Daniel replied kindly. It's okay. She walked back toward her house slowly, her steps lighter than before. Daniel watched her go, feeling the tension in his chest ease a little. This conversation, as uncomfortable as it had been, was necessary. It closed a chapter that needed closing, and he appreciated that she had come forward to say what needed to be said. Daniel closed the door and walked back to the living room. He sat down again. But now the worry he had felt earlier had lifted. The house felt peaceful again. The air felt clearer, but the day wasn't over, and he still wanted to get back to the calm he had started with. So after a few minutes of rest, he headed back outside to the pool. The sun had lowered slightly, casting softer shadows across the yard. The water glimmered gently, welcoming him back. He settled into his chair again, leaned back, and sighed. This time the sigh wasn't from frustration. It was from relief. He picked up his book, though he barely read it. His mind drifted again, but this time in a different direction. Instead of replaying the stressful moment, thought about how easily misunderstandings happen between people who hardly know each other. How assumptions can grow quickly when there is silence instead of conversation. How a neighborhood feels more like home when people choose to understand each other instead of judge each other. He wondered what the coming days would be like now. Maybe Mrs. Alden would be more approachable. Maybe they'd exchange friendly waves. Maybe this strange situation would actually lead to better neighborly communication. It was a surprising thought that something so awkward might end up improving things in the long run. After a little while, he stood up again and walked around the pool, checking the plants he had planted along the fence. They were growing well. Fresh leaves, brighter colors, every small sign of growth made him feel proud. He had put effort into this place. It was slowly turning into something beautiful. He paused near the corner where the fence met the house. From there, he could see the small gap between his property and Mrs. Alden's. Her yard was neat and quiet. Her windows were closed, curtains tucked in carefully. She seemed like someone who liked order, who felt safer when things were predictable. Maybe that's why she reacted the way she did. Maybe she thought she was protecting something familiar. Daniel nodded to himself. He could understand that. Even if the situation had been stressful, he could see the human side of it. He returned to his chair and sat down once more, letting the last bit of sunlight warm his skin. The evening breeze gently shifted the leaves of the plants, creating a soft rustling sound. The world around him felt calm again. For the first time since the officers arrived, Daniel allowed himself to relax fully. He closed his eyes, feeling the quiet settle in like a blanket. The tension from earlier was gone, replaced by a soft acceptance of everything that had happened. Maybe the day had not gone the way he expected, but it had ended on a better note than he feared. Little did he know, this was only part of a story that would continue unfolding, one that would eventually reveal more truths, more lessons, and more moments that would stay with him for a long time. The morning after everything changed felt strangely calm, almost like the world was trying to pretend nothing unusual had happened. But inside, everything felt different. The air carried a quiet tension, like the moment just before the first drop of rain. And even though no one said it out loud, everyone could feel that things were moving towards something bigger. He woke up earlier than usual, long before the sun fully climbed over the rooftops. There was no alarm, just the weight of thoughts that had piled up through the night. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, letting his feet rest on the cool floor. It helped him think. It helped him breathe. He tried to go over every detail again: the meeting, the unexpected decisions, the strange silence from a few people who usually had plenty to say. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that nothing about this situation was random. Someone was pulling strings. Someone wanted things to go in a very specific direction. When he finally stepped outside, the world looked almost too peaceful. The morning breeze brushed lightly against the trees, making the leaves shimmer in soft waves. Cars passed by slowly, people walked their pets, and the neighborhood carried its usual rhythm. If someone didn't know what happened, they'd think the day was just like any other. But he did know, and that made everything feel sharper. On the way to the office, he kept replaying the conversation he had with the woman from the previous night. Her voice replayed over and over in his mind, not because it was dramatic, but because it was steady, calm, and honest. She wasn't trying to impress him or scare him. She was trying to warn him. And now, more than ever, her words made sense. When he reached the building, he paused outside for a moment. It looked the same as always: tall glass windows, shining floors, people walking in with their usual routines. But today, he noticed details he had never paid attention to before. The extra guards near the elevator. The way people whispered near the hallway, quickly stopping when he got close. Even the receptionist gave him a nervous smile. The kind people give when they want to say something but don't know if they should. He didn't confront anyone. He just nodded politely and kept walking. If there was one thing he had learned by now, it was that quiet observation was more powerful than loud questions. As he entered his office, he found something unexpected on his desk: a small envelope. No name, no markings, just a simple envelope placed carefully in the center of the table. He looked around to see if anyone else was nearby, but the hallway behind him was empty. So he sat down, opened it gently, and pulled out the folded piece of paper inside. There were only 6 words written on it. Not everyone is who they seem. No signature, no explanation. His heart didn't race. His hands didn't shake. Instead, a quiet certainty settled over him. Someone inside the building was watching everything closely, and someone else didn't like it. He leaned back in his chair, letting the note rest on the table as he stared at it. The message wasn't threatening. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply a reminder, a nudge in the direction he was already heading. He placed the note inside a drawer and locked it. Whether it was meant to help him or mislead him didn't matter yet. What mattered was that he had to be more careful. As the day went on, the atmosphere in the building grew heavier. People spoke quietly, avoided certain topics, and walked around with unusual caution. Even the meetings felt different. The usual polite discussions turned stiff. The usual easy smiles vanished. Something was shifting beneath the surface, and everyone sensed it, even if they pretended not to. But the strangest moment came in the afternoon. He received a message asking him to come to a small conference room on the 3rd floor. It wasn't unusual; people called him into meetings all the time. But the tone of the message was slightly off. It was short, almost too short, and lacked the usual details. Still, he went. Pretending not to notice would have brought more attention. When he stepped into the room, only one person was sitting there. It was someone he recognized but didn't interact with often. The man looked nervous, his hands clasped tightly on the table. He didn't look up when the door opened. After a long pause, the man finally spoke. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. The words were soft, but the seriousness in them made the room feel smaller. He sat down across from him and waited. He didn't rush him or interrupt. He could tell the man was fighting an internal battle, one part wanting to speak, another part terrified of saying too much. After a deep breath, the man continued. "You're being watched," he whispered. "Not just here, everywhere. Someone wants to control the narrative and you're standing in their way." There was no surprise, only confirmation. "Why tell me?" he asked calmly. The man hesitated again before answering. "Because you're the only one asking the right questions, and you're the only one who hasn't done anything wrong." The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Not the uncomfortable kind of silence, more like the kind that comes right before the truth starts to unfold. The man slid a small card across the table. It was blank on the front, but on the back there was a handwritten address and a time. Nothing else. "If you want answers," the man said, "go there tonight. But don't tell anyone you're going." He didn't respond immediately. He studied the card, the handwriting, the careful simplicity of it. Everything about it suggested planning, caution, intent. When he finally looked up, the man was already standing. "I never met you today," the man said quietly. "Remember that." And just like that, he walked out. Closing the door gently behind him, he sat in the empty room for a few minutes, letting everything settle. There was no fear, no hesitation, just a strange calmness that came from knowing he was finally getting closer to the truth. That evening, Hugh drove to the address on the card. It wasn't a hidden place or an abandoned building like in dramatic stories. It was a small cafe on the edge of town, quiet and simple. A place where people came to read or work, not to scheme. Inside, the warm smell of coffee filled the air, and soft music played in the background. There were only a few customers scattered around. No one looked suspicious. No one stared. He took a seat at a corner table, just as the card instructed. A few minutes later, a woman approached him, not the same woman from before, but someone entirely new. She sat down without waiting for permission. Offering a gentle smile, "You're looking for the truth," she said softly, "and we think it's time you finally heard it." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a trick. Her voice carried honesty, maybe even empathy. He leaned in slightly. Ready to listen? The woman took a slow breath before beginning. "There are things happening behind. It's the scenes that most people never notice," she explained. "Decisions are being made not because they're right, but because someone wants control. You were never meant to see it, but now that you have, you need to understand exactly what you're dealing with." She reached into her bag and placed a sealed folder on the table. "This," she said, tapping it lightly, "is everything you weren't supposed to find out." He didn't open it yet. He simply looked at it, feeling the weight of what it represented. The woman continued quietly. "The next steps you take will determine everything. Not just for you, but for everyone involved. So think carefully before you decide what to do with what's inside this folder." He nodded slowly. He understood the truth wasn't just information. It was responsibility. After the woman left, he sat alone for a long time. The cafe grew quieter, the sky dimmed, and the evening settled in gently. He finally opened the folder, and with each page he turned, things became clearer, and by the time he finished reading, he knew exactly what he needed to do next. The story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The days that followed felt strangely calm compared to everything that had happened before. The air in the neighborhood seemed softer, quieter, like a heavy cloud had finally lifted. Daniel woke up each morning with a clearer mind. And even though the memory of the incident still lingered, it no longer carried the sting it once did. Instead, it felt like something he had walked through, learned from, and left behind. He stepped into his backyard one morning, coffee in hand, and paused by the pool. The surface was still and bright, reflecting the early sunlight. This place, which had become a symbol of misunderstanding for a brief moment, was back to being his peaceful corner. He breathed in slowly, feeling the calm settle into him. He thought about how everything had unfolded, the officers showing up, the confusion, the questions, the neighbors' assumptions. If someone had told him months ago that simply sitting by his own pool would bring the police to his door, he wouldn't have believed it. But life had a strange way of surprising people, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. And now, somehow, things were better. Not perfect, not magically smooth, but better. Later that morning, as he placed a few tools in the storage shed, he heard a sound he had learned to recognize well over the last few weeks, the soft creak of his neighbor's side gate. He glanced up and saw Mrs. Alden slowly walking toward the fence. She held something small in her hand, wrapped neatly in a simple cloth. Her pace was slower today, almost hesitant. For a second, Daniel wondered if she might turn back and return inside. But she didn't. Instead, she reached the edge of her yard and gave a small, polite wave. Daniel wiped his hands and stepped closer. "Good morning," she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. He nodded. "Good morning." There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, but cautious. She held up the bundle in her hand. I baked something. It's nothing special, just a recipe I've used for years. I wanted to bring it over sooner, but, well, I wasn't sure if it would be welcome." Daniel felt his expression warm. "That's kind of you." She nodded slowly, then took a small breath. "I owe you more than just this." I have been thinking a lot about that day, about the assumptions I made, and I wanted to say again that I'm sorry. Truly, I misunderstood, and I caused trouble that never should have happened. Daniel didn't rush to speak. He gave her the moment to finish. She looked down at her hands. It's not easy admitting when you're wrong. But I was wrong, and I'm trying to do better. Daniel nodded gently. I know it wasn't easy for you. And I appreciate the apology, really. We're neighbors, we're supposed to look out for each other, right? We just took a strange road to get here. For the first time in a long while, Mrs. Alden let out a small laugh. Soft and almost surprised. Strange road indeed, she said. She handed him the wrapped treat, and he accepted it with a steady smile. Thank you, he said. You're welcome. She hesitated again, then added, if you ever need anything. Anything at all? I'm right next door, he nodded. Same here. She gave one final nod and turned to head back toward her home. Walking with a lighter step than before, Daniel watched her for a second, then looked down at the bundle in his hands. He didn't know what she had baked, but the gesture meant more than whatever was inside. He went inside, placed the treat on the counter, and let the moment sink in. Later that afternoon, something small but unexpected happened. One of the officers from that day, Officer Reed, came by the neighborhood on routine patrol. When he saw Daniel in the yard, he stopped and approached the fence. How's everything going? Reed asked with a friendly tone. Much better, Daniel replied. Reed gave a slow nod. I'm glad to hear it. That day was rough. You handled it well, though. Not everyone does in those situations. Daniel shrugged modestly. I was confused more than anything. Didn't know what was happening? Reed chuckled softly. I believe you. We could tell. Daniel leaned against the fence. Thanks for being calm about it. That's part of the job, Reed said. But it's always easier when the person we're talking to stays calm too. You made it a lot smoother than it could have been. Daniel appreciated the words more than he expected. The officer looked around the yard. Looks peaceful here now. It is, Daniel said. Feels like it again. Reed nodded, then added, if you ever need to report anything or have questions, just give the department a call. We're around. Daniel smiled. Will do, thanks. The officer waved goodbye and continued down the street as the day moved on. Daniel found himself thinking about how differently things could have turned out, how misunderstandings, fear, and assumptions could easily turn a simple moment into something serious. But he also thought about the conversations that came after, the apologies, the slow rebuilding of trust. He remembered something his grandfather used to say, people aren't perfect, but they aren't meant to be. What matters is what they do after they realize they're wrong. Those words felt true now more than ever. That evening, Daniel decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. He hadn't done that much since moving in, mostly because he worked a lot and kept to himself. But today felt like the right time. He walked past quiet houses, trimmed lawns, and friendly lights glowing in windows. A couple walking their dogs smiled at him. A teenager practicing basketball waved as he passed. Even people he hadn't met before nodded and greeted him. The neighborhood suddenly felt less like a group of houses and more like a place where he belonged. When he returned home, he stopped by the pool again. The water rippled gently as the evening breeze passed over it. The sky above turned a soft shade of gold, then slowly deepened into orange and pink. He sat down, placing his hands on the cool stone edge. There was no fear left. No tension. No misunderstandings waiting to happen, just calm. He thought about everything the officers had told him, about his conversation with Mrs. Alden, about how quickly things had changed. And he realized something important. Sometimes, the biggest shifts in life happen not in grand moments, but in small ones, like a simple apology at a fence, a quiet conversation in a backyard, or a neighbor finally seeing you for who you really are. He closed his eyes, and let the peacefulness settle over him. This was his home. And for the first time since moving in, it truly felt like it. As he opened his eyes and watched the colors of the sunset reflect off the surface of the water, he realized something else too. This strange experience had taught him patience, understanding, and the importance of communication. Maybe he and Mrs. Alden wouldn't become best friends or visit each other all the time, but they had a foundation, now a beginning. They respected each other, and that was enough. Daniel stayed by the pool until the sky turned dark and the stars appeared one by one. The night air was cooler now, brushing against his skin in a gentle way. He leaned back in his chair, feeling rested. The chaos from before was nothing more than a memory, a story he would one day tell with a calm voice. Maybe even a bit of humor, because now, standing on the other side of it, he understood something deeply. Sometimes people make mistakes. Sometimes people misjudge. Sometimes people act out of fear. But sometimes in this matter, most people learn. People grow. People make things right. And that's what turned a stressful afternoon into a moment of change. Daniel looked at his peaceful guard and felt grateful. Not just for the calm or the comfort of his home, but for the reminder that even the hardest moments can lead to better ones. And with that thought, he finally stood up, stretched, and walked inside. His home felt warm and safe, and he knew, without any doubt, that everything had truly changed for the better.